The military academy on Zaurin Prime buzzed with a restless energy. Rows of young alien recruits, their scaled skin glinting under the harsh light of the facility, jostled and whispered among themselves. The anticipation was evident. A living legend was about to address them. Yet, for all their excitement, skepticism brewed beneath the surface. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, and silence fell. General Kaler entered, his gait steady but unhurried, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Unlike the recruits, whose youthful scales shimmered in vibrant hues of green and gold, Kaler's skin was a weathered shade of ash. The ridges of his face bore the marks of countless battles, each scar a silent testament to his survival. His eyes, deep-set and unyielding, scanned the room with a sharpness that seemed to cut through the cadet's bravado. One of the recruits, a tall and broad-shouldered Zaurin named Trevik, leaned toward his neighbor and muttered just loud enough to be overheard. "This is the great General Kaler? He looks more like a relic than a warrior." A flicker of amusement crossed Kaler's face, but he said nothing. Instead, he stepped onto the elevated platform at the front of the room. His movements were measured, deliberate, as if every step carried the weight of 1,000 memories. The room remained hushed. The recruit's earlier whispers now replaced with an uneasy curiosity. "I have stood on 100 battlefields," Kaler began, his voice low but resonant, each word carefully chosen. "I have faced enemies who towered over me, enemies who could tear through armor with a single blow, and enemies who wielded weapons so advanced they seemed like magic. Yet none were more formidable than the humans of Earth." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of disbelief and indignation. Trevik was the first to speak up, his tone edged with incredulity. "Humans? The soft-skinned primitives with no natural armor, no claws, no psionic abilities? What could they possibly have that makes them formidable?" Kaler's gaze fixed on Trevik, unblinking. "You speak as one who has never faced them," he replied. "But you will listen, for I did not come here to argue. I came to teach." Trevik sank back into his seat, but his expression remained defiant. The other cadets leaned forward, their interest piqued despite their skepticism. Kaler allowed the silence to stretch, commanding their attention without effort. "When the Zaurin Empire set its sights on Earth, we believed it would be a swift conquest," Kaler continued. "After all, their technology was primitive by our standards, their defenses laughable. But we underestimated them gravely. We mistook their lack of physical advantages for weakness and their disunity for chaos. We failed to see the strength that lies within them, a strength born of desperation, ingenuity, and an unyielding spirit." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room. The cadets, though skeptical, were now captivated. Even Trevik's scowl had softened into a look of cautious interest. "I was there during the Battle of Jansen Ridge," Kaler said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if speaking the name alone carried a heavy burden. "It was a desolate place, a wasteland of ash and stone. Our forces outnumbered theirs 5-1. Victory should have been inevitable." He stepped closer to the edge of the platform, his imposing figure looming over the cadets. "But the humans, they did not fight like any enemy we had faced before. They did not rely on superior firepower or advanced technology. Instead, they turned the land itself into a weapon. They dug trenches, laid traps, and used every piece of their environment to their advantage. When their weapons failed, they fought with their bare hands. When their bodies broke, they crawled. And when they were dying, they still refused to surrender." A tense silence filled the room. The cadets exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence now visibly shaken. Trevik crossed his arms but said nothing, his defiance tempered by the weight of Kaler's words. "Why would they do that?" Another cadet finally asked, his voice tinged with genuine curiosity. What could drive them to such extremes? Kaler's expression softened, a rare flicker of vulnerability crossing his battle-hardened face. For them, it was not just about survival. It was about protecting their families, their homes, and their way of life. Humans fight with a ferocity that comes from having everything to lose. They do not fight for conquest or glory, but for the ones they love. He straightened, his voice growing firm once more. That is their strength, and it is why we, an empire with far greater resources and power, could not break them. The cadets sat in stunned silence, their earlier bravado now replaced with a dawning respect. Kaler's gaze lingered on them, as if measuring the impact of his words. I tell you this not to glorify our enemy, but to prepare you, he said, his tone sharp. The universe is vast, and you will face many adversaries. Do not underestimate them, as we once underestimated the humans. Strength is not always visible. It is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet and unyielding, like the roots of a great tree that weather every storm. With that, Kaler turned and began to leave the platform. But before he could step away, Trevik's voice cut through the silence. General Kaler, he called, his tone hesitant but no longer mocking. If they were so strong, how did you survive? Kaler paused, his back to the cadets. Because I learned to respect them, he said simply. And because, despite everything, one of them showed me mercy. He walked out of the room without another word, leaving the cadets to grapple with the weight of his story. The silence that followed was heavy, not with doubt, but with the kind of reflection that could shape futures. The room was heavy with anticipation as General Kaler turned back to the cadets, his imposing form framed by the sharp light of the academy. The skepticism in their eyes had dimmed, replaced by a glimmer of curiosity that tugged at their youthful arrogance. He could sense it. A crack in their pride, a seed of doubt planted by the truths they had not yet fully grasped. For Kaler, the next part of his story was not merely a lesson. It was a memory carved into his very being. You wanted to know what made humans formidable. Kaler began, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. Let me tell you about the day I truly understood. The cadets leaned in, their scaled faces reflecting the glow of the projection that appeared behind Kaler. It displayed a barren landscape, a wasteland of jagged cliffs and ash-covered ground. The image was haunting, but it was nothing compared to the battle that had taken place there. It was the battle of ravaged fields, Kaler said, his gaze distant. Our objective was simple: overrun a human outpost that was barely defended. Intelligence reported minimal resistance. It should have been a routine sweep over an hour's. We were wrong. The memory surged forward, vivid and unrelenting. Kaler saw himself once more, leading a Zauran squad through the choking haze of Earth atmosphere. Their bio-enhanced armor hummed faintly, shields rippling as they moved. Ahead of them lay the outpost, a series of makeshift barricades constructed from scraps of metal and concrete. It looked pitiful, almost laughable. The humans waited until we were in range, Kaler said, his voice tightening. Then they sprang their trap. The cadets stiffened as Kaler recounted the sudden eruption of chaos. The ground beneath his squad had detonated, releasing a cloud of improvised shrapnel, scraps of metal, sharpened glass, anything that could cut or maim. Half of his unit fell instantly, their shields unable to withstand the sheer unpredictability of the attack. The survivors, disoriented and wounded, scrambled to regroup, but the humans pressed their advantage. They didn't have our technology or our firepower, Kaler said, pacing slowly across the room. But they had something else: imagination. They used the terrain to funnel us into kill zones, forcing us into positions where our numbers meant nothing. Every rock, every trench, every ruined vehicle was a weapon in their hands. One cadet raised a clawed hand tentatively. What weapons did they use? Surely nothing that could overpower Zauran technology. Kaler's lips tightened. Their weapons were crude by our standards. Kinetic rifles, explosives made from salvaged materials, electromagnetic disruptors that they cobbled together in workshops barely fit to house livestock. But it didn't matter. What they lacked in sophistication, they made up for with precision and ingenuity. He gestured toward the projection, which shifted to show a human soldier standing atop a pile of rubble, his face streaked with dirt and blood. "That is Captain Roy Carter. I met him that day, not as an ally, but as an enemy." The cadets stared at the image, their expressions a mixture of fascination and disbelief. Carter's build was unremarkable by Zauran standards, his frame lacking the imposing musculature they associated with strength. Yet there was something in his eyes, a defiance, a determination that seemed to radiate from the image itself. "He led the defense," Kaler said. "We cornered his platoon in a ravine, thinking the battle was won. But Carter refused to retreat. Instead, he ordered his soldiers to hold their ground, while he and 2 others launched a counteroffensive." The room seemed to hold its breath as Kaler described the chaos that followed. Carter's team had used EMP charges to disable the Zauran squad shields, forcing them into hand-to-hand combat. What the humans lacked in physical strength, they compensated for with strategy and sheer audacity. Carter himself had faced Kaler in close quarters, wielding nothing but a blade scavenged from a fallen Zauran. "I remember every moment of that fight," Kaler said, his voice dropping. "He was already injured, bleeding, limping, but he fought like a beast cornered. Each strike was calculated, each movement deliberate. I overpowered him, of course. His body could not match mine. But his mind was a weapon I had not anticipated." One of the younger cadets spoke hesitantly. "You defeated him, though. Why does he matter?" Kaler's gaze fixed on the cadet unblinking, because even as I stood over him, ready to strike the final blow, he did not surrender. He stared up at me, blood in his mouth, and said, "Do it, alien. But know this, you'll never win." "Not really." The silence that followed was deafening. The cadets exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Kaler's words settling over them like a shroud. Even Trevik, who had scoffed at Kaler's earlier remarks, seemed lost in thought. "I spared him," Kaler admitted after a moment, "not out of mercy, but out of respect. In him, I saw something I had never seen before, a strength that did not come from muscle or weaponry, but from conviction. He fought not for himself, but for those who depended on him. And that, cadets, is what makes humans dangerous. They do not fight for conquest. They fight for survival, for each other, and for the belief that they have something worth protecting." He turned back to the projection, which now displayed an aerial view of the battlefield, littered with the remains of both Zauran and human soldiers. "We won the Battle of Ravaged Fields," he said quietly, "but it was a hollow victory. We paid a price far greater than we anticipated, and the humans, they gained something far more valuable. They proved that they could stand against us, and that knowledge gave them hope." Kaler stepped down from the platform, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silent room. He stopped in front of Trevik, who met his gaze with a mix of defiance and unease. "You asked what makes humans formidable," Kaler said, his voice low but firm. "Now you know. And if you ever face them, remember this. They will fight until their last breath, not because they are fearless, but because they are unwilling to let fear define them." He turned and walked toward the exit, his silhouette framed by the glow of the projection. Before leaving, he glanced over his shoulder and added, "But this is only the beginning of what I learned. If you think their bravery is impressive, wait until you hear about their endurance." With that, he was gone, leaving the cadets to grapple with the weight of his words and the realization that the humans they had dismissed so easily were not the adversaries they had imagined. The silence in the hall lingered, heavy with unspoken questions. General Kaler returned to the center of the room, his expression unreadable. The cadets, their earlier bravado, now dulled by the weight of his stories, waited for him to speak. He let the quiet stretch for a moment longer before beginning again, his voice softer this time, but no less commanding. "You have heard of their bravery in battle," he said, pacing slowly. "But what truly makes humans extraordinary is not found on the battlefield. It is found in how they endure, how they survive, and what they fight for beyond themselves. Let me tell you of their families." The cadets exchanged confused glances. Families? The Zauran species did not share the human concept of familial bonds. Offspring were raised collectively, without attachment to specific parents. The idea that such connections could be a source of strength was alien to them. Kaler stopped and faced the recruits, his expression firm. It was during the siege of Alvara City. Our fleet had surrounded the human settlement, cutting off all supplies. For weeks, we bombarded their defenses, expecting them to crumble. Yet they held on, not because of their military might, but because of their people. The projection behind him flickered to life, showing images of the city during the siege. The cadets saw crumbling buildings, streets turned to rubble, and humans huddled together in makeshift shelters. Despite the devastation, there was something in their faces, an unyielding determination that seemed to defy logic. There was a man I remember from that time, Kaler continued. He was not a soldier. He carried no weapon, wore no armor. He was just a father, protecting his family. The image shifted to show a human male, his clothes torn and his face streaked with grime. He crouched in the corner of a ruined building, shielding 2 children with his body. Despite the fear in his eyes, there was a fierce resolve in the way he held them close. I encountered him during a patrol, Kaler said. Our unit had been sent to clear out survivors. When we entered the building, he stood in front of his children unarmed and refused to move. He knew we could kill him in an instant, but he did not waver. A cadet in the front row frowned, his scaled brow furrowing. Why would he do that? He had no chance of stopping you. Because, Kaler said, his voice tinged with something almost like reverence. To him, those children were worth more than his life. Humans fight for their families, not because they are stronger, but because they cannot imagine a world without them. That is a power far greater than any weapon. The cadets shifted uneasily. The concept was difficult to grasp, and yet they could not deny the weight of Kaler's words. He turned back to the projection, which now showed scenes of humans in underground shelters, children laughing despite the danger, mothers tending to the wounded, fathers reinforcing barricades with whatever they could find. Even under the constant threat of death, they found ways to live, Kaler said. They rationed their food, shared their water, and kept each other alive. They did not abandon the weak or the injured. Instead, they adapted, forming networks of support that allowed them to endure far longer than we had anticipated. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. We underestimated them, because we thought survival was purely physical. But for humans, survival is emotional, spiritual. It is about protecting what matters most to them, even when the odds are impossible. One of the younger cadets raised his voice, his tone hesitant but curious. But wouldn't those bonds make them vulnerable? If they care so much about each other, wouldn't that be a weakness? Kaler's expression darkened, and for a moment, the weight of his years seemed to settle on his shoulders. We thought the same, he admitted. We believed that by targeting their families, we could break them. We were wrong. The projection shifted again, this time showing a group of humans standing amidst the ruins of a neighborhood. Despite the destruction around them, they stood united, their faces grim but determined. Kaler's voice grew quieter as he continued. We destroyed their homes, their schools, their places of worship. We thought it would crush their spirit, but it only strengthened their resolve. Each loss fueled their fight. Each life taken became a reason for them to push harder, to hold on longer. Their families were not a weakness. They were their greatest strength. He stepped closer to the cadets, his tone growing sharper. You must understand this if you are ever to face them. Humans do not fight alone. When you face one, you face all those they fight for. Their strength comes from those connections, from the knowledge that their sacrifice will mean something to someone they love. The room was utterly silent. Even Trevik, who had been openly skeptical at the beginning, now looked thoughtful. Kaler's words had stripped away the cadets' preconceptions, leaving them with a truth that was difficult to ignore. I learned this lesson the hard way, Kaler said, his voice softening once more. During the siege of Alvara City, we believed we had won. Their defenses had fallen. Their soldiers were scattered. But then, out of the ruins they came, civilians, armed with whatever they could find. Men, women, even children. They fought not because they thought they could win, but because they refused to let their families be taken. His eyes grew distant, the memory of that day vivid in his mind. I watched them hold the line, watched fathers shield their sons, watched brothers carry their wounded sisters. And in that moment, I understood what made them so powerful. It was not their weapons or their tactics. It was their love, their unity. We took everything from them, and yet they still had each other. That was something we could never destroy. Kaler stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the cadets one final time. You may think yourself stronger, smarter, more advanced. But if you face humans and fail to understand what drives them, you will lose. They will endure where others fall. They will fight for the ones they love, and they will never stop. He turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the room. Before he reached the door, he paused and glanced over his shoulder. And if you think their survival is remarkable, wait until you see what they can build from the ashes. With that, he was gone, leaving the cadets to wrestle with the knowledge he had shared and the challenge it presented to everything they believed. The room remained heavy with silence after General Kaler's departure, his words lingering like the smoke of a battlefield long extinguished. The cadets, so vibrant with youthful arrogance only hours before, now sat subdued, their scaled hands fidgeting or resting idly on their knees. Each of them carried the weight of Kaler's revelations, the images of human resilience etched into their minds. Trevik, who had been the most defiant of them all, rose from his seat abruptly. The sound of his movement broke the silence, drawing every eye in the room. His jaw tightened and his claws flexed involuntarily. "Why should we fear them?" he demanded, though his voice wavered with something that sounded suspiciously like doubt. "Humans may be clever, even brave, but they're still weaker than us. Aren't they?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, until a sharp hiss signaled the reopening of the doors. Kaler returned, his tall frame casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the entire hall. His gaze landed on Trevik, not with reprimand but with quiet scrutiny. "They are weaker," Kaler said finally, his voice calm but carrying the force of conviction. "Weaker in body, in technology, even in numbers. But if you still think strength is measured only by those things, you've learned nothing." Trevik held his ground, though his uncertainty was plain. "Then what is the lesson, General? What is it we're supposed to understand?" Kaler approached the platform once more, his steps deliberate. When he reached the center, he surveyed the room, his expression unreadable. "Let me tell you about the last time I faced a human, not as an enemy, but as a savior." The projection screen flickered to life again, this time showing an image of a devastated battlefield. Smoke curled into the sky, obscuring the sun, and the ground was littered with broken weapons and fallen soldiers, both Zauran and human. In the center of the carnage, a single figure knelt, a human soldier, cradling a wounded comrade. This was near the end of the campaign. Kaler began, his voice low. "We had broken through their defenses. The battle was ours. But as I walked among the ruins, I came across this man. He was injured, bleeding from multiple wounds, but he refused to leave his comrade behind. I ordered him to surrender, expecting defiance or fear. Instead, he looked up at me and said, 'Help him first.'" The cadet stiffened, some exchanging bewildered glances. Trevik's eyes narrowed. "He asked you for help." Kaler nodded. "Yes." And in that moment, I realized the depth of their strength. Humans value life, not just their own, but the lives of others, even their enemies. That soldier knew he was at my mercy, yet his first thought was not for himself. It was for the man he carried. A murmur rippled through the room, the cadets struggling to reconcile this with their understanding of war. Kaler continued, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I helped them both," he admitted. "Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. In that instant, I saw the truth that had eluded me for so long. Humans are not extraordinary because they are stronger or smarter or better equipped. They are extraordinary because they fight for more than survival. They fight for each other, for ideals, for a future they believe in, and they do so with a courage that defies all logic. He turned to face the projection, which now showed the aftermath of the battle. Human and Zauran soldiers stood side by side, tending to the wounded and burying the dead. The scene was surreal, a stark contrast to the chaos that had come before. That day, I understood the greatest lesson of all, Kaler said, his tone softening. Victory is not always about defeating your enemy. Sometimes it is about understanding them. And through that understanding, we find a path forward, not through conquest, but through coexistence. The room was silent, the cadets hanging on his every word. Kaler's gaze swept over them, lingering on Trevik, who now looked more thoughtful than defiant. You will face many enemies in your lifetimes, Kaler continued. Some will be stronger, some weaker, but none will challenge you as the humans did. They taught me that true strength lies not in what you destroy, but in what you protect. And it is that lesson you must carry with you if you are to lead, to survive, and to thrive. He stepped down from the platform, his presence no less commanding as he moved among the cadets. Remember this, war is easy. It is the aftermath that tests us. The choices we make after the fighting stops will define us far more than any victory ever could. As he reached the doors, he turned back one final time. The humans taught me that, and if you are wise, you will learn from them too. With that, he was gone, leaving the cadets to sit in silence, each of them grappling with the weight of what they had heard. Trevik, still standing, lowered himself slowly back into his seat. For once, he had no words. None of them did. The room remained still for a long moment, the gravity of Kaler's revelations sinking deep into the hearts of those who had listened. The lessons were not easy, nor were they comforting, but they were necessary, and as the cadets filed out of the hall one by one, their faces etched with quiet determination, it was clear that they would not forget them. As Kaler reached the threshold of the hall, a soundless ripple moved through the cadets. One by one, they rose to their feet, their arms lifting in a silent salute. The gesture was unspoken, instinctive, and deeply reverent. It carried no bravado, only respect, a rare acknowledgement that the old warrior had given them something far greater than tactical knowledge. He had shown them the soul of their greatest adversaries. Kaler paused, his gaze sweeping over the room. For a brief moment, the hardened lines of his face softened. He gave them a small, solemn nod, the closest he had come to showing gratitude in years. Without another word, he turned and strode through the doorway, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet. Outside, the academy's spires gleamed under the pale light of Zauran's twin moons. Kaler looked up, his thoughts drifting to the humans he had once fought, and the lessons they had taught him. A faint smile tugged at his lips. The next generation of Zauran soldiers, he realized, would not see Earthlings as mere enemies. They would see them as a force to admire, to respect, and perhaps one day to emulate. Satisfied, Kaler disappeared into the shadows, leaving the academy behind.